Welcome to East Coast Winemaking, the podcast that brings professional winemaking experience from popular wine regions on the East Coast of the United States to wherever you are. I'm your host, John Monier. I'm a Finger Lakes winemaker, and I'm excited to provide easy access to educational and entertaining interviews with other winemakers and industry professionals. In each episode, we'll cover the background and unique perspective of my guest on how they approach the craft of winemaking. I'm excited for the opportunity to learn from seasoned wine pros and hope these interviews can be informative to both colleagues in the industry as well as relative newcomers. Feel free to email questions or comments to eastcoastwinemaking@gmail.com and follow us at East Coast Winemaking on Instagram to be notified when new episodes come out. If you're interested in checking out my wine called John Albert, you can find info on that at johnalbertwine.com. I'm starting off this podcast with a suite of interviews with Finger Lakes winemakers, since the Finger Lakes is the region in which I reside and work. Episode number 1 in this Finger Lakes suite, I interview my friend Matt Denci. Matt is a super smart guy and a super talented winemaker. He's the head winemaker at a winery called Treleaven, which is on the west side of Cayuga Lake, as well as the head winemaker for his own project called Entelecheia. I want to thank you in advance for your generosity while I figure out the best way to interview and set up these questions. I learned from this podcast that in the future I'd like to get a little bit more in the weeds, be a little bit more of a wine nerd. But I think that Matt and I had a great conversation, and I hope you enjoy it. Thanks for joining me.
Happy to be here.
Tell me.
Happy to be here at my house.
Happy to be here at your house. Will you tell me a little bit about your origin story? Mm-hmm. I know some of your history of how you've been here in the Finger Lakes, but I'm wondering how you got into the wine game, where your interest began, and then how you ended up where you are now.
Yeah. It was sort of a twofold thing that kind of lured me into the wine industry. One, my dad got into wine kind of through my maternal grandfather. I'd kind of lured him into it, and then
into production.
No, just wine drinking. My dad was always a beer guy. We were not really an alcohol family. We were very Midwestern. Have a beer. That was all I ever remember. When I was little.
Mm-hmm.
But my maternal grandfather, more sophisticated, a little more urbane, East Coast, knew wine, enjoyed cigars, had some pretty good taste.
Sure.
And he sort of rubbed off on my dad over time. And so dad kind of got into wine, and dad doesn't do anything half measures really. So he got really into wine.
Good for him.
And so that was where I kind of got exposure of wine's a thing, and this is a world and all of that.
How old were you when you were having those initial wine experiences?
16, 17, not super young.
Prime impressionable age.
Yeah, I was probably heading out of high school into college.
That's ahead of me, but that was way before my interest began.
Yeah, it's not even interest as much as awareness.
Sure.
Of just this is a thing, this is a world, people talk about it, it's interesting. And I'd say the other prong is that when I was an undergrad, my undergrad college has a weird habit of churning out winemakers.
That's cool.
Yeah, so
where is that?
St. John's College in Maryland. It's basically all.
Is that the same one that August DeMille went to?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
So him, myself, Emily Grazier at Hosmer. Let's see, the Turley family out in California has a connection. The Kongsgaard in California have a connection. Frog's Leap is connected. And of course, the big granddaddy of them all, who really made the whole thing happen, Warren Winiarski of Stag's Leap, and the Paris tasting of 76 was like a former professor.
Wow.
Yeah, and so like he went out, blew up, and then people just kind of like got drawn to him and then seeded themselves across California. And like gradually there was sort of like an alumni network of people for like wine.
So you're in a long line.
In a way.
So how did that turn into practical? Like what's the connection between? How did you end up in a cellar for the first time?
So like between this alumni network and like interest from just like kind of being aware of wine, and the other thing to know about my undergrad in St. John's College is like it's extremely heady and like academic, bookish. I learned ancient Greek. I studied French. We did quantum physics. Like you get into a lot of very abstract stuff.
It does sound like a lot of winemakers I know.
But like what really drove it for me was I was just like, I've had 4 years of like epicycles and like crazy kind of abstract stuff. I would love to do manual labor for a while. That sounds really nice. And so the appeal of doing something physical and doing something manual and like producing a product and being kind of more connected to what you're doing and like the romance of wine definitely played a role into it. And I was like, shit, if I can like work a harvest and like do some traveling after like college and kind of like pay for that, huge win. Like, sign me up. So that was kind of the initial hook.
Sure.
And I got dumb lucky in that my first harvest, I was like talking to my then girlfriend at the time, and I was like, yeah, this is what I'm thinking about doing. Like, I don't know, blah, blah, blah. And she's like, oh, our family friend, like he owns a winery. Like you should send him an email. He needs help in the fall. And I'm like, oh, okay. Like, sure. And then they're like, yeah, like this is the name of his winery. It's called like Domaine du Blair. I was like, huh, it's kind of a funny name. I like go on Google, look it up, and I'm like, oh shit, this dude has a winery in Burgundy.
Wow.
And so I sent him an email and I was like, can I come work for you? Like I'm like a friend of the like, you know, her family. And he was like, yeah, I need help. Yeah, come on by. So like my first harvest was like 10 weeks in Burgundy, picking grapes and like making, you know, Premier, Grand Cru, Chardonnay, Pinot.
Kind of sounds like it was kismet.
Oh, it was way too nice.
It was like serendipitous.
It was pretty amazing.
At that point, did you like have in your mind well enough, like winemaking in general, to feel like you took any educational things away from that first experience?
Realistically,
or were you too new to?
I was pretty new. Like I was trying. Like I had worked in a wine shop a couple of summers before that, and like I like spent one summer just reading the World Atlas of Wine.
Oh wow!
Like maybe not cover to cover, but pretty close.
That's an undertaking.
I didn't have a lot going on that summer. So like I knew stuff, but like your first harvest is like, how much do you really ever learn from your first harvest?
No, that was why I asked. I mean, the first couple of years for me in the industry were such a blur that I would have felt exactly the same way. I think I would have taken nothing from that experience.
Yeah, like what I took from that experience was like hands off, like quote unquote natural winemaking can work. You need the like incredible amount of labor it takes. Like I think about it now, like I make 100 tons now with basically myself, an assistant, and 2 interns, and we're like, whoa, we're well staffed. And like there were probably 15 interns for a place of like 30 tons. And it's because we did all the picking, and then we split it in half, and then half would go and process and crush, and you know, the other half would keep picking the rest of the day. But like the labor involved in like making wine in that way, we would, you know, hand sort the hand picked clusters as they went into the crusher destemmer. And then there'd be another group on the other side of the crusher destemmer, hand picking out berries
Oh my
that had
gosh.
already been crushed destemmed. Like it was a lot of work that went into it. And so like that was definitely part of it. And then the other thing that I just soaked up was just like culture. Like my boss would show up each morning with like it looked like a bag of charcoal, like, you know, hard, like papery, plasticky sort of material. And it was like a dozen baguettes. And he's like, this is like your daily baguette for all of you interns.
I didn't want to assume that it was baguettes, but it makes me really happy that it was a big bag of
100%.
A bag of baguettes.
And like, you know, every morning, like the Australians have smoko, the French have crèche-croûte, which is like break bread.
Mm-hmm.
So like we get out at 7, start picking, and then around like 9, you'd all like come out of the vineyard and just like eat bread and cheese and drink like aligoté, which is sort of like the lesser white grape of Burgundy.
Yeah, I'm learning to love aligoté.
Yeah, and like it's just like stuff like that. We're like, oh wow, like this is an industry where you can work really hard and also like be treated pretty well. Like this is cool. This is much nicer than I expected.
Yeah, fun.
And like my boss was a big, like he loved food. He like loved wine. He loved food. You know, his wife put it to me one day where she was like English and very pragmatic, and she's like, you know, sometimes I eat because I just need to eat and get on with my day. She's like, Blair, which is her husband, my boss, and she's like, Blair has a bad meal, it ruins his day. And so for harvest, he hires a chef who would cook us. He wouldn't do breakfast, but he'd do lunch and dinner, and we'd have like 4-course lunch, 3-course dinner every night. Bottles of wine on the table, like crazy. He made us beef Wellington for the last night. Like part of the experience was just being like blown away by like what hospitality and like food and wine and like community in like this weird hot box situation that is harvest.
Wow.
Like so those were the things I like realistically took away.
Nice. Well, I want to ask you some questions about what you're doing now at Treleaven, where you're currently employed. But will you give me like a quick, you know, here, then here, then here of the places that you were between this experience that you're talking about and where you are now?
Yeah. So real quick, it was Burgundy, Matua down in New Zealand, doing $10 dump trucks of Sauvignon Blanc. And then Flowers out in California, back on the Chard and Pinot Trail. And then to a place called Medhurst out in Australia, in the Yarra, outside of Melbourne. And then Summer in the Vines back in Burgundy. And then Finger Lakes. And I was at Red Newt as an intern in 17. Stuck around for bottling a little bit in the spring of 18. Got poached to go to Keuka Spring as the assistant. And I was there for 18 months before getting poached to go do Treleaven.
Exciting. I didn't realize that you had done that much traveling. I know based on conversations that we had before that you had some of these other experiences. I had no idea you were so traveled.
Yeah, well, like a lot of folks like around here have like a winery and a home base. So they're like, oh yeah, like I work at this winery, and then once in a while they let me go do a harvest. Like growing up in Rhode Island, like there's no home base. Like if I wanted to do a harvest, there was nowhere to come back to. So I just had to keep going to new places.
Sure.
So it kind of forced me to.
Yeah, makes sense. So up to current, now you're head winemaker at Treleaven on Cayuga Lake.
Yep.
And you're the head winemaker for your own project, Entelecheia. Is that right?
Yeah.
Great. Will you tell me any of the origin story that you know about how Treleaven started, and then about how you started your project and some of the lore?
The mythos. Yeah, so Treleaven started in official, like formally, I think the vineyard was planted in 82. I think the first vintage was like 86.
Cool.
Yeah, so it's older than people realize. Pete and Tacey Saltonstall were the ones who founded it. They went out to the West Coast, so like Napa and Sonoma back in the day, and were kind of taken with the wine industry and kind of the notion of American wines. but also really inspired by Burgundy and the idea of like a small family domain. And so they really focused on Chard and Pinot when they started. Like they love Chardonnay, and that's like the majority of what the vineyard is planted to originally. Nowadays, because of like consumer demand, there's more Riesling, but they really, especially in the early days of the Finger Lakes, they made a name for themselves under like as a Chardonnay house.
Oh, they're after my own heart.
Yeah, like
I love Chardonnay so much.
Yeah, they're all about it, and like that was really what they kind of planted their flag on. They had planted a couple other things, Gewürztraminer. There was some vignoles for a little bit, like this and that, and then a lot of it's kind of been winnowed down over time, either through like attrition and like Gewürztraminer didn't make it, and things like the vignoles just like rots a lot, doesn't sell that great, kind of stuff like that. And so now it's a little more, the vineyard's a little more simplified. And so originally for a long time, it was just the Sultan stalls. And then actually their like first or second winemaker they hired was actually Dave Breeden
Really?
of Sheldrake fame. Yeah.
No kidding. He's on my list of people to interview.
Yeah. So he started out in like, I think it was like, I want to say early 2000s as like Treleaven's winemaker.
Wow.
Yeah. So he was there for a little bit and then moved on to Sheldrake. And then there's been kind of a couple of people before me. And
now you're the man.
Now I am the man in the big chair, as they say.
Nice. Well, I want to ask you about Treleaven's like portfolio and what kind of wines they make. But before I glaze over it, what was the like motivation for you to start this project that you're doing, and what's your philosophy going into it?
Yeah, so for Entelecheia, part of the impetus was just a certain amount of restlessness. I wanted to try and kind of make some of my own wine, and like, just like run my own fermentations, like see what happens. Like, because as an assistant, you can learn a lot, but it's always kind of not filtered, but like through the lens of the winemaker. And so I think over time, as you kind of grow as an assistant and like grow into the role, you start being like, but what about this? What about this? Like, and the winemaker's like, I've answered these questions for myself sufficiently. Like, they're not super interested in them because they've, come to their own conclusions. But you're still like trying to figure it out and like, what about? And like, just want to do something that's yours, I think. So some of it was that. And some of it was like, having come up in Burgundy and having come up more in the world of Chardonnay and Pinot Noir rather than Riesling, in terms of like training and what I saw like going around, like what people do for Chardonnay in like California or Burgundy is really different than how the Finger Lakes handles Riesling. If like hand picking is kind of seen as de rigueur, whereas like here it's much more common as machine pick. Press cuts were a thing in California, and just like there were things like that where I was like, oh man, I wonder if I took some of these like hyper premium Chardonnay techniques and applied them to Riesling, could I do anything kind of fun and interesting?
When you say press cuts, you mean like stopping the press after a certain pressure and separating?
Yeah, separating juice from different stages of the press.
Yeah.
Things like that. And just sort of like longer lees contacts. And the thing that I really wanted to do was I felt like at least for my initial vintage, my like thought or angle was that a lot of Finger Lakes dry Rieslings are kind of hard to drink and like really aggressive, really acidic, and there's like a masochistic side to a dry Riesling sometimes. And like I wanted something that was a little more generous and a little more feeling not opulent, but like a little bit more full and like easier to drink.
Yeah, a little more approachable.
Yeah, and I thought like that would be something I wanted to explore. But like, frankly, the first vintage was a real just sort of like, I'm gonna try this flyer. I don't know what I'm doing. And it was only in what was it? I guess the winter of 18 going into 19. I ended up I visited Champagne, and like visited a couple of champagne houses and kind of like really caught the sparkling bug. And so I kind of like cobbled together this idea where I was gonna get a couple of tons of Riesling handpicked, because like growers always complain if you ask them to handpick, but if you tell them it's for sparkling, that's like the one time where they'll kind of like shrug and be like, fine.
They understand.
Yeah, they like
they acquiesce.
They acquiesce. I don't think they understand. They just know that like if you say it's for sparkling, they're not gonna win. And so I had this idea that I would get 2 tons, pick it early for sparkling, and then like, because in Champagne they talk about like tête de cuvée, and then what are they called? The butts, I'm forgetting what the very like hardest pressing is called, but like the very like,
is it like the tie or something like that?
Yes, that's exactly what it is. Yeah, the cut. And so like the tie, and then they separate them all out, and like usually the first free run is like what they use for premium stuff. The cuvée is kind of the main body, and then the tie is usually sent off for like long aging to become reserve wine eventually, or whatever. And I was like, well, I definitely don't have the resources to do that, but with Riesling, I can take the free run, turn it into sparkling, which will be fun, and then I can use the hard pressings to be like cabinet, and then I'm not wasting everything, and I can make 2 styles of wine that I really like.
Oh, wow. So those 2 wines, what vintage did you start doing this in? 19. So the 19 wines from your project are from the same lot of grapes?
Yeah, same vineyard, same pick, same pressing.
Oh, that's super interesting.
Yeah, it's just free run versus the pressings. Is the only like grape distinction. They're obviously handled very differently.
Sure. You mentioned your first vintage. What was your first vintage of that wine?
So the 18 is the first Entelecheia Wine Cellars vintage.
And have you done some sort of wine under this label every year?
Yeah.
Sparkling every year?
Since 19, sparkling every year.
Interesting.
So
you've only disgorged 1 vintage, is that right?
Yeah, the 19s disgorged, the 20s due to get disgorged August 9th.
Exciting.
I just booked it.
What kind of, if you have this off the top of your head, grams per liter in the dosage of sugar, what did you end up doing?
The 19 was 9.
That's about what we're doing.
Yeah, the 19's 9. And I always knew it was going to be high for the 19. It was a cold vintage. Lahoma's a cool site. I've actually just figured out, or 99% figured out, I'm going to double check just to be sure, the 20, which radically different vintage, hot, drought, all that good stuff. 20 is going to be like 4 or 5.
Cool.
Yeah,
it'll be interesting
way
to
lower.
taste those side by side.
Yeah, the 20's much rounder, richer. There's a golden aspect to the 20 that the 19 never had.
Were they picked at similar ripeness levels, those 2 vintages?
Yeah, within like a brick of each other. Like maybe I think the 20 might have been 19 and the 19 was 18.
And that early on there was still a noticeable difference in the way that they read.
Oh yeah.
The fact that
like
they were close when you picked them.
Yeah, I think it's sun more than anything. Like in 20 the grapes were golden, and in 19 the grapes were pretty green.
The green of Finger Lakes Riesling.
Yeah, I mean, in 19, I picked sparkling the first week of October.
Wow.
Yeah, and 20, I think I picked it sometime in like the 22nd of September. Like it was a good 10 days.
Yeah, okay.
Earlier.
Interesting.
Different vineyard sites, different, couple of things, but.
Do you expect to stay with Riesling with Entelecheia, or do you expect to experiment with other varieties or other styles of wine?
Definitely gonna play around with some other varieties. I'm hoping to get some Pinot this year. Maybe try and do like a sparkling rosé.
Nice.
Um, other styles, we'll see. Um, I'm really enjoying the sparkling like kick. It's fun. It's easy to sell, frankly. Like people love bubbles.
Everybody loves sparkling.
Everybody loves sparkling, and it's one thing I have noticed is like it's in many ways a much less crowded lane as a small producer than saying I make really great, Riesling, and people are like, yeah, we have a million Finger Lakes Riesling, bro. Like we get it. Like
I'm concerned about that. I just made my first vintage of wine under my label, and it's Riesling, and I have been worried about trying to sell it. It's not bottled yet, but I'm not looking forward to having that fight.
Yeah, like it's not like I'm sure right. I don't make a lot of Riesling. You're probably not making a lot of Riesling. Like it'll sell and that's fine, but it's definitely one of those where like even though it's really good, there's so much Finger Lakes Riesling floating around in the world.
Yeah, the market's kind of saturated.
Yeah, it's much harder to find your niche. Whereas I felt like with sparkling, I have much more readily been like seen as like, oh wow, like you're like you're sparkling producer, like that's so cool, that's so different. Like I think it takes up much more real estate in people's mind that I make sparkling, especially as like a really small brand. And I can kind of like part of the appeal of sparkling is like, right, 1 ton of sparkling goes a lot further than 1 ton of still.
Sure.
In terms of like the distance between me and Herman Weimer in terms of still wine, like vast. The distance of me and Herman Weimer in terms of sparkling wine, still vast, but like a much more manageable number. Like I'm more like, at least in the Finger Lakes, you can be much quicker, a bigger player with sparkling than I think you can be with still, because so many people are intimidated by the investment of time and money and effort and pain in the ass.
And it seems like hardware. It seems like there are a couple places that can disgorge, and a lot of people who are getting into sparkling wine are forced to go to these couple places. I mean, it's no surprise that investing in that hardware is a huge expense, and there's just not a lot of it in a region that has so many wineries.
Yeah, right. That's definitely part of it. Is like sparkling's always been specialized, and it's always more hurdles to get into.
Yeah, I wonder if that's also driving people's interest in pet nat production. At least is because it's more straightforward.
Oh yeah. Oh my god. You don't have to disgorge it. I do think it's better if you disgorge it.
It's also my personal preference, but
yeah,
I'm not out here to tell anybody how to make wine.
Yeah, but like, and the other big thing I've been looking at, pet nat, because it's lower pressure, you don't need the like full traditional method champagne bottles.
Really?
You can get away. There's a lower pressure bottle that's meant for like pet nats and stuff like that.
That's interesting. I'm not sure do they look different? I mean, could you recognize them from the outside, or do they look like sparkling bottles?
They look like sparkling bottles. They're a little, right? They're not quite as robust. Like the walls aren't as thick because they're not made for the same amount of pressure.
Lower pressure, yeah.
But like, from a cost perspective, a case of empty sparkling glass costs it's stupid now. It's like $20 to $24 for a case of empty sparkling glass. And this lower one is like 14.
Oh wow!
Like it's a significant drop. So like I think part of the reason pet nat's appealing is that you can get this cheaper glass.
Yeah, now
and have cheaper, like it's cheaper in any number of ways.
Just in the short time that we've been talking about it, we've come up with 2 or 3 reasons why pet nat is a more attractive option rather than really method champenois style sparkling.
Yeah, and I think in like for me personally and for like my mind is like sort of the appeal of doing traditional method is sort of the road less taken is like it's much easier to stand out if you say, yeah, I went through the pain in the ass, and yeah, it's expensive, and yeah, you're going to pay for it, but you know what? it's sparkling. You always are going to pay for it. Like, and I think people are much more willing to pay for it.
Sure.
Like, you know, I charge $35 a bottle for my sparkling, and almost without fail, people are like, "That's a good price."
Wow.
Yeah.
That's good to know. I'll keep that in mind I hope to make some sparkling wine this year. So.
Yeah, like people are willing to pay a premium for traditional method sparkling. Absolutely. Like if I asked for $35 a bottle for dry Riesling, like unless I've got some killer reputation and name, but like if I was a nobody doing that,
it's probably gonna get passed.
It's just gonna be a lot slower, right? It's gonna take more time.
Yeah.
Whereas like I sold 2019 is basically gone. It has not even been a year.
Wow.
Yeah, it is sold.
Congratulations, that's awesome.
Yeah, it's great. It's really been well received, but like I think the fact that it's sparkling, the demand is much broader than like if it was just regular Riesling, and people are willing to pay more.
While we're talking about how good it is, where can people find that wine? In the Treleaven tasting room, online?
Yeah, so online at treleavenwines.com. There's a little subsection in the wines for Entelecheia. It is available in the tasting room at Treleaven. And then find retailers around New York. I am incredibly I have many outlets in Ithaca. They've got a spot, Pinnacle up in Rochester carries it. A bunch of restaurants in Geneva. I still gotta get on the wine shops in Geneva. Padula's.
Yeah, they're high on my list of places to hopefully sell wine to. So let me know how that goes.
Yeah.
Before we get too far away, tell me about Treleaven's portfolio and the wines that you're making for them.
Yeah. So with Treleaven, it's a much more traditional Finger Lakes portfolio. We do a little bit of everything. You know, there's a lot of pride of place put on the Chardonnays because that's just how the winery sort of thinks of itself. They're like the Pete and Tacey, one of the Chardonnays is literally named after Tacey, and I have to like run it by her before it can go into like final bottling and stuff.
It's good to have that quality control sometimes.
Yeah, it's a little stressful.
Do you know her style? Do you make that wine to fit the style that you know that she prefers?
That has been the intention, yeah. I've had to like she's grown, I think, a little more fond of like richer styles of Chardonnay over time. And like we have a reserve Chardonnay that does that. And so I've been like trying to pull her into like something a little bit like less oaked and fresher.
Yeah, a little
but
lighter.
it's very much like, you know, I can't push it. It's gotta be slow, kind of.
Well, maybe now's a good time while I'm thinking about it. Would you describe some of the differences that you're doing to achieve the stylistic difference between this particular Chardonnay and the reserve that you mentioned, and if there are any others, like how you treat them differently, oak use, lees stirring, that sort of thing?
Yeah. Oh gosh. In case of the Chardonnays, there's been a lot of focus put on making sure that they're different. Especially because almost all of our Chardonnay, it's pretty rare nowadays, comes from our state vineyard. So, you know, it's all grown in the same place. It's all harvested within a couple of weeks of each other. And so the fruit is different, but you're not talking like huge swathes of difference. And so it's kind of on me in the cellar to sort of really reinforce these. And so what we did is the reserve Chardonnay these days basically is the best lot or so of juice that comes in, you know, kind of whatever tastes best, ripest, best acid, all that kind of stuff is kind of separated out for that. That'll go entirely into barrels, native fermentation, some amount of like settling and clarifying before it goes into barrels, but then the reserve is super hands off. It's
wow.
Native yeast, native ML, 16 months in barrels.
In your experience, do all those barrels want to take off on their own native?
Yeah, they go pretty easy. It varies a little bit vintage to vintage, but the nice thing is like, because now that we're holding the barrels over harvest into like the next winter, it means that I have no pressure to like rush them through for summertime. And so, like, I have some that are still not totally dry.
Really?
Yeah, they're at like minus 1.6, minus 1.7. Like, they're real close.
Still now in July?
Yeah, like I gotta double check them, but last I checked, 2-3 weeks ago.
And you're not concerned about that?
No, not really.
And presumably you haven't added any SO2.
No SO2 into those. There's a couple that have finished that I've gotten SO2'd, but no, the ones that are still going, no SO2, just top them monthly. Give them a stir once in a while.
Topping them in your experience is enough to stop them from getting like aldehydic or...
Yeah, and then they get a little aldehydic, and then they kick up, and that consumes all the aldehydes.
Interesting.
And like between that, and they're obviously going through ML at the same time. And so like between like ML ticking along, the little spurts of fermentation that happen, and stirring them occasionally, along with topping, that usually is enough to keep them fresh. And I think like a slight nuttiness in a barrel fermented Chardonnay is not the end of the world.
Sure. Yeah, stylistically, if it makes sense anywhere, it's probably there.
Yeah. So.
Sorry, so I cut you off. So you were explaining that this is the reserve chard and that it's pretty hands off. And I asked you to go down this rabbit hole of fermentation. So you can continue now with some of the other Chardonnays and what makes them special.
Yeah, and so then the Tasties Chardonnay, which is kind of like our main line, kind of more like bulk of the program, kind of the heart of our Chardonnay, is usually kind of slightly less ripe fruit, a little bit more focused on like higher acid stuff for freshness. And then that is stainless steel fermented. Usually, I've gone back and forth on co-knocking it with ML. It goes through ML no matter what, but I've recently played around with letting it go through that in a more like traditional consecutive manner to like bring a little more character to it.
Do you feel it does that?
I'm still trying to nail down the Tasties. It definitely helps having it go through ML.
After?
Yeah,
alcoholic?
After primary. Just because like with stainless steel and the Finger Lakes, like they can really easily kind of get boring and taste like nothing. And so I feel like letting ML take place after primary and having it impart a little bit of extra character and flavor as opposed to just bringing more fruit to the table, I think just helps bring a little intrigue, bring a little something else. So yeah, that stays on lees up through, around June, May, June.
Any stirring?
Not really. Once in a while, the Tasties, I haven't gotten as dialed in, so there's been more variation year to year in terms of what I do. Normally, there's not tons. This year, I let it go native, and I let it do secondary, let it go through ML, not co-inoculated. So there was more stirring involved to keep it fresh, keep it from getting aldehydic, because it took much longer. But like that's not always the case.
Sure. And was there a third Chardonnay?
There is, yeah. There's our Silver Lining Chardonnay. It's really that's the most entry level. It's frankly meant to be sort of the like Pinot Grigio of our lineup. A little bit of RS. Unassuming, meant to just kind of be your porch wine. So that's very easy. That's
Does that seed barrel?
No.
All stainless steel. Stainless shard.
Stainless shard. Oh yeah.
Oh wow, interesting.
Yeah, all stainless steel. Inoculated usually with something like Vin 13 or something to kind of really push some thiols and some fruit to it, and then stopped a little bit early, just to bring a little bit of extra weight to it. Because stainless can be thin. Yeah,
interesting. So now, if you would hit us with some of the other varieties that you're making. Now that I asked you to go down this chard tangent, because
guess who loves Chardonnay?
Because I'm obsessed.
So the other varieties, it's a bunch, right? It's like everyone in the Finger Lakes. We do Riesling, we do Cab Franc, we have a varietally labeled Merlot, we have a stainless steel Cab Franc. We've been doing Petit Syrah the past couple of years.
Really?
Yeah. That's a hoot and a half. That is a weird grape, especially in the Finger Lakes.
What makes you say that?
Well, it comes in incredibly dark, incredibly tannic, incredibly acidic, and very low sugar.
What an animal.
It's intense.
Oh, well, this is reminding me of another question that I wanted to ask you, and maybe I'm off base on this. I vaguely remember you having an Instagram post that you were doing some co-fermentation, some red variety, and like Gewürztraminer.
Yeah.
Is this the variety that you did it with?
It's 100%. Yeah, that's what it is.
Was that 100% of that of Petite Syrah that you brought in that year?
Yeah, that is the one. Oh, 100%.
Oh, wow. Well, how did that turn out? I remember seeing it and thinking that's the craziest thing I've ever heard of.
It turned out great. Yeah, like we sort of stumbled into it with the first vintage of Petite Syrah we did after the fact. Like we had it in barrel. We had the Petite in barrels, and there was a concern that like, yeah, it's good, but like it's pretty intense. It's gonna need time to kind of unwind. And so we were looking at ways to sort of take the intensity down a little bit. And
you chose maybe the most intense white variety.
And so I just needed the acid to come down and the tannin to chill out a little bit.
That sounds like Gewürz.
Exactly. And I was like, well, you know what? Like 5% of Viognier works in Northern Rhone Syrah. Like, and I've always wanted to do this. I've been thinking about putting Gewürztraminer in some high acid red variety for ages.
That is so interesting.
Yeah, I've talked about it ever since I was at Cuca Spring with August. So I would be like, we should totally do this. These reds are not always super ripe. They're usually high acid.
Was that 22 that you did that? Or have you done it for multiple vintages now?
So 21 was the first year where we where they blended post fermentation. 22 there wasn't enough. There was like a small crop to begin with, and then the vineyard called and was like, yeah, whatever was left the deer ate. So like there's nothing to give you. So 23 was the next vintage, and that we liked what happened in 21 when we blended in the Chard or the Gewürz, and so we just did it on purpose.
Was it 5%?
No. This year we were more like 15, 16.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, it's basically 2.5 tons of Petite and a half ton of Gewürz.
Wow, interesting. And how does the final wine turn out? Can you taste the Gewürz in it?
I don't think you would know there was Gewürz in it if I didn't tell you.
Really?
I don't know if you would say, "Oh, it's Petite Syrah." If I didn't
sure
tell you,
I would not, because I don't think I could pick Petite Syrah out of a lineup. But
yeah, but like you can totally if you look for it, there's like a florality to the nose that is very Gewürztraminer. And I think you notice it mostly on the aromatics, but like, man, it also does just open up the palate and the finish, and just kind of take it from something that's kind of got the screws on super tight, and just turn it into like a really fun, like this year's vintage. I mean, it's still kind of in bottle shock, so like it needs to figure that out. But like this year's vintage is like cranberries and like much more. It's like almost like a fun like bistro red in a lot of ways, is how it kind of turns out. But,
interesting.
Yeah,
bistro red. I like that.
Yeah, like there's lots of acid, but there's cool fruit, and there's lots of spice. There's like very like savory turmeric-y sort of things going on.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not like there's there's good alcohol, but like it's not like a tannic monster.
You just named some of the varieties you make. Do you have any like very particular favorites that every year, like if you had to do away with all of them but 2 or 3, are there some that you find yourself drawn to as a winemaker?
As a winemaker, I mean, it's a boring answer, but Riesling is definitely one I would like. I'll always work with Riesling.
Well, you're in the right region for it.
I know, that's why I'm here. Is like so cool, can do so many things. Such flexibility, there's like no wrong way to pick Riesling. You just have to choose the right way to ferment it. And then other varieties that I like really love working with. I have a soft spot for Cab Franc. I really, especially in the rosés, I really enjoy the Cab Franc rosés we make.
Oh, I'm not sure if you mentioned, do you make a rosé at Treleaven?
Yeah. Okay, dry rosé, and
What variety do you use for it?
varies. Sourcing reds has been a real challenge, and so it is entirely up to what we can get our hands on in a given year. So 2023 is 100% Cab Franc. 2022 was like Cab Franc, Cab Sauv, Pinot Noir, Blau. I was just like, any grapes that were not nailed down, I was putting in the rosé because I knew we needed rosé, and I knew we did not have a lot of reds.
Does that mean you were doing like a Saignée? Were you drying off of other tanks that you had going? Were you doing direct press with some small amounts of all these varieties for that particular wine that you were describing?
For that particular wine, it wasn't Saignée. They were mostly cold soaked, but I was just kind of like cutting any flesh off of the red program that didn't need to be there, especially coming after 21 where we had made a mountain of reds. I was just like, yeah, we need rosé. Yeah, we need rosé. So just be like, this Welch bin, rosé. That Welch bin, rosé. Like rosé, rosé, rosé. Like 2022, we produced 2 red wines.
Really?
Technically 3, but yeah, we made 2 that are available to the public, 1 just for our club, down from like normally 6 probably. So like we made a Meritage, we made a like a barrel fermented Cab Franc, and that was all we made for reds in 2022.
Wow.
Everything else just went into rosé. And we had barely enough rosé.
How about if like regions weren't as important and you could grow any variety that you wanted in the Finger Lakes? Are there any varieties, like maybe just 1 or 2, that you would love the opportunity to work with, but so far you haven't?
Yeah, I really want to play around with Nebbiolo.
Really?
Yeah, I had a huge crush on Barolo and Barbaresco. Huge, like they're such cool wines. They don't make any sense. They're like pale, acidic, tannic, but like really beautifully aromatic. I'd love to play around with Nebbiolo if I was like in a magical world we could do anything.
Mm-hmm.
Other things that if I had to just pick one other one.
Yeah, I'm gonna make it hard on you and.
I'm gonna cheat and actually Mencia. I'm gonna go a little out on left field. Mencia. I've like been thinking about it. I've enjoyed the ones I've had. They apparently have like an experimental planting down in Long Island.
Really?
Yeah, actually makes a lot of sense in Long Island to me.
I'm not sure how Mencia likes to grow, so I'll take your word for it.
Yeah, like it's northwestern Spain, so it's like wet and damp and sandy, so like it's not crazy. But yeah, I really enjoy the reds that I've had come out of Mencia, and I can't bring myself to name a single white. It's like Chenin, Semillon, Assyrtiko.
So let's see. We talked about some fermentation stuff. At Treleaven and for Entelecheia, what kind of closures are you using for your still wine? Are you using all corks, or are you using some screw cap?
We're all cork.
Agglomerated or natural?
Treleaven is agglomerated. Entelecheia is natural.
Interesting.
The sparkling is a sparkling cork, so
of course,
it's kind of its own thing.
Why did you choose to go natural with Entelecheia instead of like Diem's or something like that? I mean, was it strictly price related, or is it philosophy based?
Yeah, I started out using D10s from Diem, and
for Entelecheia.
For Entelecheia, yeah. For the 18 and the 19. And I don't know if it's just vanity, but I didn't really want to pay the premium you pay for D30s. And on the 2020 vintage, I was really proud and really happy of it. And so I decided I was going to invest in some nicer natural corks, because I think they'll I think over the long haul, over like, once you get beyond 10 years, I think they're probably going to hold up better. But that's something I've gone back and forth on. Yeah.
Yeah, of course, it makes sense. Especially Riesling in the Finger Lakes, it doesn't take long to find examples where wines can last a long time. And thinking about how corks affect or closures in general affect the wine that you're making, that you feel so passionate about, like a decade or more into the future, is something that can sometimes like make it hard to sleep at night. You hope that you have the opportunity in 15 years to open a bottle of wine that you made and have it be this beautiful thing.
I mean, that's kind of the dream.
God willing.
Yeah, and it's a trade-off, right? Because like there is a real consistency with Diam that I feel like is there, where like I think there's much less variation bottle to bottle, under like Diams and these agglomerated corks, just because they are a man-made product and they can meet certain tighter specs. But I am hoping that natural cork will reward me a little bit better on the long run.
It'll be interesting to see. God willing, we'll have the opportunity to taste one of your wines that has been in bottle for 10 or more years, and we'll have that answer.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully.
Or at least a data point.
A data point more so. And I mean, it's part of it is that like the wines that I'm making for Entelecheia, the still is it's a cabernet. It's low alcohol. There's hefty amounts of residual sugar. There's high acid. It's a pH of fucking 3. And so like it has all the stuffing to age really beautifully. And so I wanted to try and give it the best chance to do that, which is kind of part of what pushed me into maybe more natural cork.
Sure. Okay, I've just got a couple more questions for you. Something I meant to ask you when we were talking about like some specifics of some of the things that you're doing in the cellar with different wines. I'm wondering what your philosophy is and what your practice is on additions of all sorts. Are you chaptalizing? Are you acidifying/deacidifying? Are you adding nutrient, that sort of thing?
Yeah. So I've basically never acidified, or deacidified for that matter. I feel like you mess with acid and you can almost always taste it.
Interesting.
Like I think it's really hard to tinker with acid and not have it kind of leave an impact in a taste sense, even not just like in a chemistry sense, but like it just feels weird.
If you do some Googling, it's easy to find things where people talk about the different tastes of different acids. Like malic is softer than tartaric or whatever in regards to adding. And so it's easy to imagine, or maybe it's hard to imagine that it doesn't have an effect to some degree.
Yeah,
speaking
I'm not
philosophically.
Yeah, and I'm not even talking about like the flavor of acids, but like I think when you, especially deacidification, I think it messes up the palate and the mouthfeel. Like it feels kind of like washed out. Like I was actually part of a Cornell experiment where they were like, "Here, taste all these acids. Tell us what you think." And it turns out they're like, "Oh yeah, this was to see like if you can tell a difference between malic, citric, and all that sort of stuff."
And what was your experience in doing that?
In doing it, I was like, "Oh, I think this, and like the results came back, and they're like, "Yeah, once you control for the fact that some acids are stronger than others, like if you give someone the same dosage, like as long as it's pure, like as long right." The argument is that if you can, what you might be tasting when you taste different acids is impurities in the like way they were made.
Really?
Like if you have just pure citric acid and just pure malic acid, and then you adjust them for how much stronger citric is than malic, you really can't taste the difference.
Interesting.
And so anything you might be tasting in like a practical sense is probably just like faults and failures in the production of the acid, which is still like something you can take into account. But yeah, at least for me, when I'm talking about like tasting the difference, I mean like palate weight and like experientially less than like a flavor.
Sure, that totally makes sense.
So
what about yeast nutrient?
Yeast nutrient depends on the wine. I don't necessarily have a hard and fast rule for it.
Do you run Yans?
No, that's way too much work.
I don't know a lot of people that run Yans. There's not a lot of like those Foss things or anything in the Finger Lakes. I know a couple people who have them, but I think people who do either do it by feel or do it on principle. Add to every wine.
Yeah, and I live in the middle. I guess I do it by feel is the answer.
You wait till it gets stinky or slow or
it's wine by wine. Like there's wines where I'm like, oof, this fruit is weird. We're not waiting for anything. You're getting nutrient, like 2 to 3 bricks drop, hit it, like 1/3, hit it.
Interesting.
And then there's stuff where like I'm feeling like I try and like tailor my approach to each lot, where if I think these grapes have potential to be, something a little bit more, have like more to them, more to give, could be better stuff, I'm more inclined to kind of hold back on additions and things like that. Because one interesting, I don't, it's not. It's a theory, is what I'll call it. Is like, yeast nutrients are great, but like they obviously contain a bunch of flavor precursors, and there's an argument that if you add yeast nutrient to everything, you can be sort of leveling out the differences in your wines.
Interesting.
And making them slightly less distinct.
Sure.
Because they all get the same, like they all get a dose of the same amount roughly of flavor precursors. And so whatever like they might have had originally of flavor precursors, you're bringing them all kind of
closer
together. Yeah.
Makes sense.
And so
that's so interesting. I've never thought about that before, but to hear you say it like that, I mean, it makes sense.
Yeah, and it's something August brought up to me back in the day when we were working together. So kind of with that in the back of my head, stuff that I know is meant to be more kind of mainstream, like bigger production, needs that level of consistency. I'm very happy to just chuck it in, make sure I've got like nice fruity wine, everything's good. But stuff that's smaller lot or that's supposed to be somewhat premium or at least just idiosyncratic, I'm more, or if I'm just like, I think this is going to be good, I'll like hold back and either do smaller doses or no doses or kind of, maybe wait a little bit longer.
Sure. Are you adding Fermade or DAP?
Fermade, I'm not a big DAP person.
Yeah, I'm not surprised to hear you say it based on your feelings about nutrient additions in general.
Yeah,
I know DAP lovers and DAP haters is a hard line.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I've heard people be like, make sort of the flip side of the argument I made for the Fermade end, which is like DAP has no flavor precursors. It is pure basic nitrogen, and so you're not tinkering with like your fermentation flavors when you use it. But like DAP is just like crack cocaine for yeast.
Yeah.
It's rough.
It's funny. It's something that's been on my mind a lot lately as I'm trying to make some of my own wine, is based on some of my experiences. When we add DAP and you come in the next day and you look at the tops of the tanks of the wines that we made that nutrient add to, they are roaring so vigorously.
It works. Like, I have no doubt that.
It obviously works, but it does make me wonder, like, in the name of having a slow, chill, cool fermentation, if that's your goal, if adding DAP is kind of fighting against it because it so obviously kicks up the intensity, so it does make me want to experiment with different nutrients addition and things like that. So it's interesting to hear you have a more tame approach.
Yeah, and like I'm much more ready to tinker with temperature. Like I'm happy to like kind of throw a heating band on and push something warmer if I feel like it's lagging in that regard, and vice versa, chill it. And I'd much rather try and like push my fermentations using temperature rather than adds.
Sure. Yeah, of course. That totally makes sense. Okay, well, I think I'll let you go. I'm still working on what my final question should be, and I have no idea what it's going to be yet. But I know that you're going to dinner later, so maybe I'll just ask you, what will you drink with dinner? Will you drink wine? Will you drink water? Will you drink beer?
We almost always have a cocktail. I have a very large liquor
Are,
cabinet.
are you making dinner here?
Yeah.
What kind of cocktail will you make? Are you a Negroni guy?
More in the winter, like kind of cooler months.
Make
Summer,
something with cucumber in it?
no, Emily hates cucumber. Hates. So it'll be like we're big tiki people, rum people.
Ooh, nice.
So daiquiris, pina coladas. I don't have any orgeat at the moment, so like that kind of takes the Mai Tai off the table. But yeah, probably something. They're just like fun. They're summery. They're light.
A
Something
rum
like
cocktail
that.
sounds so good. I won't lie to you.
Yeah.
All right, thank you so much.
Cool. No, thank you.
Thank you all so much for listening. I'm thrilled you could make it to the end of the podcast. If you have any thoughts on questions you'd like me to ask or comments about your experience, I'd love to hear them. Please don't hesitate to email me at eastcoastwinemaking@gmail.com. Until next time, I hope you all have a wonderful day.